Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to this ATX in Focus webinar. My name is Martin, and I'm an Education Support Manager here at ACCA, and this session today is designed to support your preparation for the Advanced Taxation exam. And I'm very pleased to be joined by expert tutor Aileen Edgar. Before I hand over to Aileen, I'd just like to highlight a few housekeeping items. Now, there are a number of buttons on the bottom of your screen that you can use. You'll find a help icon on the left, and that provides resources and information to help you resolve any technical issues that you might experience. There are icons for the slides and the media player. You'll need to see both of these during the webinar, so make sure you've selected them. There's an attendee chat function, and that will enable you to engage with fellow webinar attendees, and that icon is on the right-hand side. There is also a list of available resources. You'll see an icon that looks like a file symbol, and if you click on this, you'll be able to access the resources relevant to today's webinar, including the direct links. You can rearrange your screen to suit you and resize the windows if you need to. And if at any point you can't hear what we are saying or you can't see any visuals, please do refresh your browser. Now, if you've registered for this webinar, you'll receive an email tomorrow with details of how you can listen to it again. So don't worry if you miss something or if you have any technical issues, as you'll be able to access the recording. I'm going to hand over to Aileen in a moment. And if you'd like to ask ACCA or Aileen a question, then please click on the Q&A button, which is the middle icon at the bottom of your screens. And please note that we can't guarantee responding to everyone directly, either verbally or via web chat, but we do hope that the questions that we share will be helpful to everyone. So Aileen, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. Welcome everybody to this session on advanced tax. I've been a tax tutor since 2008, working for a number of different professional accounting bodies in the UK, as well as learning providers. And now I work alongside ACCA as one of their expert tutors, and I teach tax online via courses through FME Learn Online. Now, in today's session, we are going to be covering a number of different areas, including some exam tips, particularly focusing on exam technique, the importance of mocks, and I'll be going through some of the frequently asked questions I get about advanced tax. And there will be time as well for you to ask me questions, and I'll get through as many answers as I can. Now, before we get started on the session, I'd like to ask you a little poll question. So you should see the options appear for you, which is, are you looking forward to attempting a mock exam? I think I know what the answer might be, but let's see what it comes out as. And if you can click yes or no on the poll question there to let me know whether it's something that you're looking forward to, or maybe it's something you're a little bit nervous of. I do think commonly students will say, I don't feel ready for a mock exam, but that's the point of doing a mock, is that you're not necessarily exam ready yet, but a mock is a really important step to help you get there. So if you just fill that in, then we will see if I'm right about what I think the answer is going to be. So actually, not the answer I thought it was going to be. I actually thought that people would be dreading the thought of doing a mock exam. So I'm really pleased to see that most of you are looking forward to doing this. And we'll talk a bit more about mocks throughout this session. First of all, though, we're going to look at some exam tips for the advanced tax exam, particularly around exam technique and approach. So let's focus on section A first of all. We've got one 50-mark question, but it will be broken down into a number of smaller requirements. You should allow around 90 minutes in the exam for this question. It will cover a mix of different topics across the syllabus, so it's just not possible to question spot for this exam. Within the marks available in question 1, there will be 5 marks for ethics, And those can represent some of the easier marks in the exam to get if you're well prepared. But do remember, you need to make sure you are tailoring your answer specifically to the client that we're looking at. There will also be 10 professional skills marks. And in question 1 in the exam, that will include communication. There are lots of questions available to help you study for this exam on the ACCA Study Hub. So please do make sure that that is something that you're accessing on a regular basis and practicing questions from there. Now I've got an example on the screen here of a question from the most recent examiner's report. That's from the September exam. And I just wanted to use it to highlight a few things for you. So this is question 1 from the exam. It's section A. So section A only has one question, which is the 50-mark question. So you should be spending 90 minutes on this. And there's a few things in the exam platform, and it's replicated in the practice platform as well, that you just need to be familiar with. So I've highlighted them at the top there. We've got a highlighter function where you can choose from 4 different colors and use that to highlight various words on your screen. Now, particularly in question 1, we have a lot of information to deal with at one time. And actually, some smart use of different colors can really help you. So here on the screen that you can see, I've used the yellow color, and that's to highlight a few specific things. So here I've highlighted the word ethical. Now that's because in question 1, you will have some ethics components. And then there'll be a number of other topics that you need to cover. I've also used it to highlight the word exhibits, to remind me to tell you that there will be a list of exhibits at the left-hand side of the screen, and you will use those to find out more detailed information about your client. And one of the most important exhibits I've highlighted there is work to be carried out, because that for question 1 is where you're going to find the detailed breakdown of the requirements. Now, of course, you in an exam are not necessarily going to highlight the same words. In an exam situation, I think you should be looking at highlighting things like the style that you should produce your answer in. So if you're being asked to create a memo, for example, then I would want you to be highlighting that. If you have got particular topics listed out here, highlight those perhaps. Now on the left-hand side, as I say, there's a number of exhibits that you can open. Your next step after you read that summary information on this main screen, I think should be jumping to the requirements here. Now, for question 1, there's unlikely to be very much information when you click on that exhibit. It won't give you a particularly detailed breakdown of the marks. It'll be a reminder that there's 10 professional marks available and 40 technical marks. The real bit of information you want to go to next is this work to be carried out exhibit. That's where you're going to get a much more detailed breakdown of the different requirements and the mark allocation, so you can start thinking about your timings. You do have a couple of other resources available to you at the top of the screen. You've got an online calculator you can use and a scratch pad. Now, the scratch pad is something you may or may not have used much in the past. For advanced tax, I personally don't use it very much at all, because I use a word processing answer space to map out my plan. Particularly for question 1, where there's quite often more going on in it, I use the word processing answer space to just jot down a bit of a plan for each of the requirements, and then I can always delete it before I end my exam. You know, with question 1, you've got a lot of exhibits here. Your screen can become really cluttered, so it's just a way of cutting down the amount of things you've got open at any one time. Now, you are going to have to choose what type of answer space you use to give your answer. You've got the choice of a word processor and a spreadsheet. For question 1 in particular, I would say that you will be working probably more in the word processor with some cross-referencing to the spreadsheet. And that's because question 1 has some communication professional marks. You're more likely to be setting out a memo style answer, and therefore it's more appropriate for you to be forming that answer in the word processor answer space and then jumping over to the spreadsheet as and when you need it. Just make sure you are clearly cross-referencing for your marker so that they know if you've got some workings, where to go and find them, and cross-reference over to the spreadsheet. And in the spreadsheet, make sure you put a heading on there so they know which requirement we're looking at. So that's a few different things I just wanted to highlight in terms of question 1 and what can be a lot of information to deal with in one go, but with a sort of methodical approach through it and not opening every single exhibit at the same time to see what's all in there, you can find a way of cutting down the time you spend reading and then having to reread the same things over and over again. Now, this was, as I said, from the examiner's report. So this was from the September examiner's report, and some of the comments that were also in that examiner's report on this particular question was around reading the requirement very carefully. Now, if you haven't had a look at any examiner's reports before, or it's something you kind of forget about, I really, really do implore you to make sure this is one of your things that you do as part of your revision strategy. So after this session, go onto the ACCA website, go to the advanced tax section and have a look at the most recent examiner's reports on there. They're a really good source of questions to practice, plus you get a detailed commentary from the exam team and some tips on exam technique and particular technical topics as well. So they're absolutely brilliant. Now, this particular one from September, as I say, one of the things they brought up was making sure that you reread the requirement as you answer the question. And I think it's even more important with question 1 because you've got a lot going on. You'll have read lots of different information. You've got a lot to try and keep in your head at one time. And it's all too easy once we start typing up our answer to drift off into what we think the question was about rather than what the question actually asked us to do. So please make sure you check back to those requirements every so often. So in question 1, it was in that work to be carried out exhibit. Another issue raised in the examiner's report from September was that there are actually a good number of past questions that have tested the ethical issues that came up in that exam. And therefore, students should be making sure that they pay attention to that and practice the questions that are available. Of course, there will always be a slight difference in the type of ethics question being asked, but there's definitely some common scenarios that you can make sure you're really comfortable with. But you must make sure that you are relating that back to the specific client you're looking at. We don't want to see cookie cutter, cut and paste style answers that could be any client. We want to see something that is tailored specifically to the client in the question. Another issue that came up in that report was around skepticism. Now, that's one of the categories of professional marks, and the examining team there were saying that this can be quite tricky. And they advise that candidates should note the wording used in questions where this skill is being tested and make sure they learn from it. So in the particular case of this question, it said something in the question around the company was looking to make some changes and find a new market. And that should ring some alarm bells for you to do with a major change in the nature or conduct of trade and whether there's going to be any sort of limitations on what the company thinks it's going to be able to do. Now, you're not going to be actively thinking about what the professional marks are in your exam. There's no way of you being able to determine that. You shouldn't worry about it, and you should be allocating your time based on the 80 technical marks across the whole paper. And so in terms of question 1, the 40 technical marks. However, you can absolutely learn from the examiner's reports, from doing past paper question practice. You can definitely learn some tips on how to maximize those marks. But really, the marks are going to come hand in hand with providing a good answer to the technical parts of the question. And another point that came up in this examiner's report was that it was to do with creating paragraphs for a letter. And some candidates were talking, were talking to the client, and they were writing in a very sort of general sense, but they were actually meant to be writing a letter to the client. So they should have actually directly said, you will need to do this, or you have told me this. So just little things to think about there from the examiner's report. Now, if you want a bit more help with the professional skills marks, there is some detailed information in the study hub. Excuse me for a second. And you'll find it in chapter 27 there. It goes through the different professional skills and some different tips and advice on the types of things that might be being looked for in the exam. But as I say, remember, you're not actively trying to achieve these, and your time allocation should just be based on the number of technical marks available in the question. So let's have a think about section B now. Section B in the exam has two 25-mark questions. So you should be looking to spend about 45 minutes on each one of those. Again, we see a mix of different topics come up from across the whole syllabus, so you can't question spot for these. In each of these questions, we're going to see 5 professional skills marks. So there's going to be 20 technical marks, 5 professional skills marks. And for these ones in section B, we're not going to see communication being one of those types of skills area. But again, don't focus on them. You're focusing on your technical marks. And again, for section B, there's plenty of questions available to you in the ACCA Study Hub, so you can go there and look at the questions and solutions. Now, I've got another example here of a recent question. And again, this comes from the September examiner's report. And in this one, so this is a section B question, it's a 25-mark question. You can see you've got a lot less information there to deal with compared with the section A question. So less exhibits. There's not a work to be carried out tab there. It just says requirements. So actually, if you click on the requirements tab there on the left-hand side, you are going to see the split down of the 25 marks. Now, I've just highlighted a few things there just to discuss from this particular question. One of the things you were being asked to do in this question was to give advice on the after-tax proceeds from the sale of some assets used in the client's business. And that's a common kind of approach to see this after-tax phrase. If you start looking for it, you'll see it come up in other questions. And it's a commonly missed out step. People will go, right, okay, proceeds from the sale of assets. Okay, I need to go ahead and work out, what's going on, the disposal. Let's see what we've got. How much money have we got? But we're being asked what the after tax is. So one of the important last steps to do in that question is to actually deduct the tax you've worked out on the sale from the proceeds that they will receive. And those are very straightforward marks to get. You've already done the bulk of the hard work. You just need to do that last little step. And how many people do you hear of who fail the exam on 49 or 48? And if only they'd gone back to the requirement and looked at it one more time before they finished, and if only they spotted that they hadn't done that last little step, because they've done all the work, the numbers are all there in front of them, they just need to do that last little step and they would pass that exam. So please make sure that you're looking back to the requirements on a regular basis, and this after-tax concept is definitely something you'll see in many different past papers. I'm not saying it comes up in every exam, it doesn't, but it is a common thing to see, and it's something that could get you some nice, easy marks after you've done all that work. Another key exam technique thing I wanted to highlight from this particular question was the second bullet point there, where it says we have to give advice on the income tax implications to do with making an additional contribution into a pension scheme. Now, it's telling us to focus on income tax there. So that's all we're going to do. There is no point in us talking about any other tax issues that might pop into our head when we're doing that question. They have told us income tax. Another way you might see this sort of thing being asked is give advice on the tax implications where they don't specify a particular tax. Now, in that case, you probably are looking at least 2 taxes, maybe more. So if it says tax implications, have a think. Is it income tax and national insurance? Because national insurance is a tax in its own right. Is it capital gains tax and inheritance tax that's relevant? What about VAT? Could it be relevant to the situation? Think as broadly as you can. So that's just another little exam technique thing to watch out for as you're doing your question practice. Now, again, we've got some tips in the examiner's report on that particular question. And one of the things they were saying there was that some of the information being tested was actually brought forward knowledge from taxation, and that students should be prepared to be tested on brought forward knowledge. For some of you, it might have been a while since you sat taxation. You might have been exempt from it. And therefore, it's really important for you to go into this advanced tax exam feeling confident about the foundational elements, because what you're learning at advanced tax is building on top of those. Now, there's some great resources that you can find on those on the ACCA website. There's Get Ready modules. If you haven't seen those already, you can go on, and they cover lots of assumed knowledge with little quizzes and videos on assumed knowledge from tax. You can go into the study hub. There's a taxation part of the study hub where you can do lots of little quizzes from there as well. So make sure, if you know that's an area of weakness, make sure that you are doing a little bit of revision on some of those areas. Now, I've already flagged up the issue about the after-tax proceeds, and yes, the examiner raised that in the examiner's report, that a significant number of candidates didn't actually go on to work out the after-tax proceeds. They stopped once they had worked out the tax payable. And again, as I was saying, that's such an easy step to go on and do after you've done all the hard work of actually working out the tax due. And another issue they raised was around the question in that exam about furnished holiday letting. It specifically asked them to explain one relevant tax advantage. Now, some people just completely ignored that, and they gave a couple or more advantages. So please make sure that you are just doing what's asked, no more. If they tell you to only give one advantage, you're not getting any extra points just because you give them 2. Sometimes people like to hedge their bets a little and go, well, I'm not sure if that's a strong enough answer, so I'll put down another one. Maybe one of these 2 will be okay. But please watch your time. Please watch how much time you're spending on that requirement for the marks available. And I've said already, but please make sure that you read the requirement very carefully. Pay attention to the verbs, the command words, the doing words in those requirements. Does it tell you to explain, advise, outline, calculate? What does it tell you to do there? And stick to it. Take a note of the number of marks available. Judge your time based on that. Judge the number of points that you want to make based on that. And go back and read that requirement several times throughout your answer. Read it at the beginning, more than once. Read it while you're doing your answer. And absolutely crucially, please make sure that you read the requirement before you decide, right, I'm moving on to the next question now. And here's another example of a section B question. Just a few things that I wanted to flag up here. And this is around reading the requirements. So you can see that the requirements here are broken down for you. You're told that there's 5 marks for professional marks. And then I've highlighted here all the different instructions, the things we have to remember to do. I haven't highlighted what the topic is. And I think students quite often will look at a requirement and highlight. The words they'll highlight are totally different to the words I would highlight. They'll highlight close company because that's the topic. They'll highlight travel costs because that's the topic. They'll highlight corporation tax return because that's the topic. I don't highlight any of those words. What I want to make sure I am focusing on is what I'm exactly expected to do. If I'm only asked to explain, I don't need to do any calculations. That helps me decide whether I'm using my word processor answer space or my spreadsheet, or a bit of a mixture. One of the things we see come up quite often is this phrase here, explain with supporting calculations. Now, to me, what that tells me is I think I'm going to be writing more words than I am numbers, because the calculations should support my words. They shouldn't be the main event. But all too often, students see that and go, calculations. And I'm going to do all these calculations. But actually, it's about using numbers to support your points, your advice, your conclusions. So please watch out for that phrase. I've also highlighted in there where we have to do more than one thing in a requirement. So in requirement B, for example, there it says tax implications for both the individual and the company. And again, we don't want to forget, we don't want to get so caught up in working out what it is for Dorian that we never go back and think about the company. You need to make sure that you are covering everything that is being asked. So that's why I highlight those words. I don't highlight the topics. The topics I will come to. As I get to each requirement, I will think about the topic. So close company, for example. What's a close company? Remember, that's a situation where we have a company that is controlled by 5 or fewer participators. Now, I'm going to think about that when I get to that requirement. I don't need to highlight the words close company just now. What I do need to do is make sure that when I start my requirement, I know the format of it. I've got a plan in mind. That's really important. Okay, so just wanted to go over that type of exam technique. Now, some general tips, thinking about our timings, for example. Time management. Tailor your answers.
What are some of the most frequently asked questions that we get on ATX? Probably the most frequently asked one, particularly as we get closer to the exam date, is what topics do you think are going to come up in the exam? I wish I had a crystal ball and could help you out with that. But what I can say is that you just cannot question spot for this exam. You need to make sure that you go into that exam feeling confident across the whole of the syllabus. And that's not just the ATX syllabus, also the TX syllabus, because any of those topic areas can come up in your exam. This is a multi-layer, multi-topic exam where you have a scenario which involves lots of different things happening from across the whole syllabus. There will be some marks that you find easier to get. There will be some tougher ones in there. But to give yourself the best chance of passing this exam, you need to make sure that you have covered all the areas. Please do not hide from topics that you find more challenging. The common ones I see with students are things like overseas issues, shares, all the different reliefs that we've got across the whole syllabus. But these are really important topics. They can come up just like anything else can. And you want to make sure that you spend a good amount of time revising, doing question practice on these areas that you find more difficult. Don't just stick in your comfort zone. Now, what about how we're going to choose the response option that's the most appropriate one in the exam for the question that you're looking at? Well, we've already talked about the options a little bit, but let's look at it in more detail. The verbs that you are given in the requirement are a really good way of helping you decide whether a word processor response area or a spreadsheet or a bit of a mixture would be appropriate. If the requirement only asks you to calculate, then you'd be able to use the spreadsheet in its entirety and just put your whole answer in there. If it tells you to explain with supporting calculations, then it's probably appropriate to start off your answer in the word processor and then go to the spreadsheet and do any workings in there and then come back to the word processor answer space and just do a final little piece of work there, whatever is appropriate for the requirement. Ideally, computations should be in your spreadsheet, narrative elements in the word processor. However, if you've got mainly a calculation requirement, and maybe it just asks you for a date that something's due, I think it's more than appropriate for you just to pop that at the bottom of your calculation in the spreadsheet. You can use a table function within the word processor. Sometimes that can be really effective for ATX, particularly if it's quite a short calculation you just want to set out. So there's different options there. And the best way that you can feel comfortable in the exam with making these choices is to actually practice using the practice platform, getting used to the different options. Now, question 1 will likely need some sort of memo, letter heading, report style heading on there. So a word processor would be more likely to be appropriate to begin with there for that type of question, but do pay attention to what you're told to do in the question. And when you are jumping to the spreadsheets for part of your answer, please make sure that you cross-reference for your marker. Just put a little note on the word processor answer space saying, see spreadsheet, something like that. And the marker will know, okay, now I need to go to the spreadsheet and now I'm looking for the workings. But also make sure you put a label on the top of those workings for the particular requirement or the type of calculation you're doing, you know, capital allowances for the year ended, whatever, something like that. So your marker can go, yes, I know what this is for, rather than them having to hunt around your spreadsheet trying to see if there's anything in there that ties in with what you've put in the word processor answer space. One of the most popular questions now for sure that we get for advanced tax is, there's so many rules, how on earth am I going to remember them all? What kind of ways can we make life easier for ourselves with this? Well, question practice is absolutely one of the best ways you are going to commit all those different rules to your memory and get better at answering questions in the time that you've got available in the exam. But there are lots of admin rules as well across all the different taxes. And with those, it can be quite helpful to create little revision cards for yourself, post-it notes, create mind maps, whatever works for you. Try out a few different styles and stick them everywhere. Stick them on the wall, stick them in your office, stick them in your room, bathroom, wherever. Somewhere where you're going to see them on a regular basis, or if you've got a stack of revision cards, go through them on a regular basis and test yourself. There's some great resources on the Study Hub you can use. There's some flashcards on there that you can use, which are absolutely fantastic as well, to test yourself. Back to question practice, absolutely. More question practice. You cannot do enough question practice, I don't think. So it's worth mentioning again. And while you're doing that question practice, make a little list for yourself of mistakes that you're making. Now, you might start off with a bit of a large list, but as you then make mistakes and then go back to your tuition notes and content, go onto the Study Hub, have a look at the materials on there to remind yourself of a topic, then try the question again, get it right, feel confident, and you can score that error off your list as well, which is a nice feeling. So, question practice. I'm mentioning it a third time because honestly, it's the most important thing you can do for this exam. It really does help when you're feeling overwhelmed by all the different rules, all the different topics. The taxes are starting to feel like they're all jumbled together. Question practice is absolutely going to help you, I promise. So I mentioned the flashcards. There's also quizzes in the Study Hub as well, which are really great for you to go and practice. Little short tests of your understanding. So you can go into the Study Hub and you can click on the flashcards and get these little tests of, you know, some of the terminology and also the quizzes there to test your understanding of lots of different areas within the syllabus as well. So those are some of the main questions we get asked about ATX from a sort of general exam technique point of view. So I hope that's been helpful for you.
Well, I managed to interrupt myself there, which is quite a talent. So we're going to, now we've covered those kind of frequently asked questions, let's think about those general tips as well for across the whole of the paper. So in terms of general tips that we have to think about, time management. I've mentioned it already. We really have to think about how you're going to spend your time in the exam, preparing for it. Mock exams are one of the best ways you can do to help you with your time management as well. If you think that's an issue for you, is putting yourself under that time pressure and thinking about the order that you're going to attempt the questions in as well. Because remember, you've got section A, which is that big 50-mark question, although it is split down into different requirements. And then you've got two 25-mark questions. Practice where you think you're going to spend your time in the exam. Are you going to do the 25 markers first, then leave the 50 marker last, or are you going to do the 50 marker first? It's a personal choice, and the best way that you can make that decision is actually practicing it under timed conditions yourself, and then you'll get a better feel for what is comfortable for you. One of the most important things at the advanced tax exam is tailoring your answer. Now, we know we have lots and lots of rules in tax, don't we? But you're going to have a client. So imagine that client is sitting across the table from you and you're trying to help that client. We don't want general advice. We want advice that specifically helps them. One of the things we see come up in questions is where we're maybe asked when tax is due. So some of our admin rules. And students will sometimes write, oh, well, it's due 6 months after the end of the month of death, if we were talking about inheritance tax, for example. But your client doesn't understand what that means. I know you might think that's straightforward, but a client just wants a date. The client wants to know, what date do we need to make sure the tax is paid by? So don't just put the rule down, make sure you put specific dates. Tailor it to this client's situation specifically. Make sure that you're using the practice platform and the study hub resources that are available to you in order to practice and prepare for the exam. There's lots of great technical articles on the ACCA website as well. Make sure that you are reading through those. They've got some great little examples, worked examples. They talk through some of the rules. There's that Finance Act article as well. Don't forget, look at the Finance Act article. It's not as detailed at the advanced tax level, but I also recommend you read the technical articles from the ATX part of the ACCA website as well, because assumed knowledge, as we discussed earlier, is really important. Practice makes progress. You don't have to be perfect, but you do need to be making progress. You do need to be learning from your mistakes. And sitting a mock under exam conditions is definitely something that I recommend that you do. So let's talk about some of the advantages then of sitting a mock. It gives you that way of practicing before the real exams. Don't wait until you're sitting in the exam hall or you're sitting at home in front of the exam on your computer to know what it feels like. To know what it feels like to be sitting there and having no books that you can check and only having your tax tables to help you. It's really important to put yourself in that uncomfortable position now. Better to do it now than wait till the exam. There's going to be a pre-December mock that will be available to you next week. That's for you to practice yourself, and then you'll be able to self-market on the practice platform. There's also a specimen paper, 2 practice papers on the practice platform that you can use as well, and they've been updated to the current Finance Act, so you can use those knowing that they've got all the right rates and thresholds, etc. in there. One of the things that I recommend people do as we move into this revision phase is that they actually spend as much time sometimes reviewing their answers, your answers compared with the solution, almost as much time as you're spending doing the question in the first place sometimes. And that's because you need to start thinking about your exam technique. You need to be thinking, why did I not write about VAT deregistration in my answer. Where was it? Where was the clue in the question that told me I should have done that? So it's not a case of just looking at a solution, memorising it, rote learning it, and hoping that that same thing will come up again in your exam. It's very unlikely to. So you have to learn, why are you not getting what's in the answer? Do remember, though, that a lot of the suggested solutions that you're seeing, they are the perfect answer. And sometimes they go beyond the perfect answer. And the reason for that is because they're there as a teaching tool for you, so you understand why the answer is the way it is. It's not necessarily that you have to write all of that in order to pass this exam. Absolutely not. But what you do want to do is be making sure that you're always progressing, always just fine-tuning as you move towards that exam. And by committing to doing at least one mock exam before you sit the exam, you are improving your chances of passing. Now we're going to move on and look at questions that you have been posting in. So as well as the things that I covered in that video on some of the more frequently asked questions, let's see what kind of things people have been asking during this session today. If you do have any other questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box and I'll have a look at them. Okay, so first question I wanted to have a look at here was, have you got any advice for what students who are resitting should be focusing on? Particularly if you've got somebody who got quite a low mark initially the first time around. Now, absolutely, we've got kind of, I suppose, two different categories of resitters. You can have resitters who are in the 40s and have narrowly missed out on a pass, and it's so frustrating, I know. For those people, if you're in that position, what I would say to you is, you more than likely have enough technical knowledge to pass the exam. Yes, there might be a few different areas of the syllabus that you've maybe been avoiding, that you maybe didn't quite fully understand first time around. Now's the time to make sure you crack those. But you should probably be focusing more on exam technique. So think about your time management in the exam when you attempted it before. Did you manage to finish all the questions? Did you go away thinking, yes, I understood everything, I wrote everything, I feel like I've passed, and then you failed? Well, chances are you weren't answering the question that you had been asked. You were able to write plenty, but you weren't answering what was being asked. So spend some time reviewing examiners' reports if they're available on the exam that you sat, because it'll be fresher in your mind and you'll be able to reflect on whether you made any of the mistakes that they flag up in the report. If, however, you're looking at a resit where you are quite far off the pass rate, it's more than likely that you have quite significant gaps in your knowledge. And as the person asking the question suggested, they felt that maybe it was to do with their brought forward knowledge and that it wasn't quite up to where it should be. And yes, I think that can be absolutely a reason why somebody might get quite a low score. Because as I said earlier, those taxation elements are the foundation on which you're building the ATX knowledge. And the tax knowledge and parts that come up in the questions in your advanced tax exam, those are what the examiner is going to see as easier marks. There's going to be a range of marks across the whole paper, some that are easier to get, some that are quite tricky. And if the examiner thinks that what they've put in around some brought forward knowledge from tax, so maybe something around trading adjustments or national insurance contributions, if they think those are the easier marks, they're going to balance that out with some trickier things as well. If you can't get what they think are the easier marks, you're making it really difficult for yourself. It's a real challenge then, because what are you left with? You're left with some trickier topics, and you might not feel comfortable enough with those either. So I think that might be something to reflect on. Okay, so what can you do? If you're in that situation where you feel your brought forward knowledge from tax isn't good enough, I absolutely don't recommend that you go back and restudy everything from tax. You just don't have time. And it in itself is a massive syllabus. So what I would say to you is use question practice now to tell you which areas you want to go back and focus on. So if you're doing an advanced tax past paper and it talks about something to do with VAT registration, and you think, oh goodness, I can't remember anything about that, well, that needs to go on your list of, right, I need to go and dedicate an hour of my revision to looking at VAT registration rules again. Or maybe it's something to do with national insurance contribution calculations and you think, no, I can't remember how to do them. I'm not scoring enough marks. Give yourself an hour. That's what you're going to do for that hour. There's technical articles, so go onto the ACCA website, look in the student resources for tax and go and find the technical articles. Look through those, go to the study hub, go to the national insurance part of it and work through that and do some of the short questions in there. Don't spend a huge amount of time, but enough time that then you can move on and go back to that advanced tax past paper and have a real good go at that requirement, because now you've got that basic knowledge and then you can add on the more complicated material from advanced tax. So I do think it would be a good area of focus for you if you feel that you have sat the exam before, but you were quite far off the pass mark. The other thing to look at if you have been quite far off the pass mark as well is, have you actually been doing question practice? Because I know I've talked about it a lot in this session, but it's because it is so important. I'm such a big believer in the difference that it makes to students. And if you've been sitting, reading, writing out your own notes and that type of activity, you're not preparing yourself enough for this exam. You must be doing question practice. So do have a bit of reflection on that. So I hope that helps. Another question I've got here then, we have got a question about if you don't get to finish a calculation, can you just make up a number for the after-tax proceeds? Okay, well that's an interesting one because that links back to the question we were looking at earlier, doesn't it? Which said, work out the after-tax proceeds. Now, if you've done all the work, but you've ran out of time or you haven't finished your calculation, you could just make up a number. Yes, you could. And you might get half a mark or a mark for doing the comparison. Yes. The ideal thing is that you don't run out of time. I know that's easy for me to say. Ideally, you want to get yourself in a position where you don't run out of time to do that. But at certain points in the exam, you are going to have to make a judgment call. What are you better to spend your time on? Are you better to spend your time not finishing a full calculation and moving on? I would say, generally speaking, yes. If it's a case of you haven't even tried one of the requirements yet, I do think it's a good idea for you to stop, move on, jot down what you can for that requirement, and then if you do have a little bit of time left, go back to what you were doing. Because if you don't attempt every requirement in this exam, you are making it incredibly difficult to pass, because you're shortening your odds, aren't you? If you missed out an entire 25-mark question, you have now made it so you're trying to get 50 marks out of 75. That's tough, isn't it? So make sure you write something for every requirement and do pay attention to exactly what you've been asked to do, because sometimes what you'll find is, although you're not looking to get professional marks as such, but there may well be a professional mark for, did this person calculate the after-tax proceeds? And therefore you might find there's a technical mark and a professional mark for that activity. Okay, another question coming in about, is it advisable to do all the theoretical parts of the paper first and move on to the numerical ones if you think theoretical questions are your strength, so you can secure those marks first? It can be. I think the way that I suggested that you approach the reading of the exam was to make sure that you read the requirements first and you had that kind of overview of all the requirements. So from that, you will know, say that there's 3 marks where you have to talk about the exemptions for a controlled foreign company, for example. Now, if you think, I know that area really well, I can actually do that quicker than the time available for that, then I think that might be quite a good strategy for you, yes. What I think, though, with some questions is that it actually makes more sense for you to follow the order of the question, because maybe the story's kind of building and we're thinking about, well, first of all, the person wants to do this and then they want to do this other thing. And actually, with the information available to you in the question, you feel like, actually, I'd rather just follow the order that the information's presented. But again, spending that sort of planning time at the beginning of each bigger question, you can make that judgment. You can make that judgment call. There will be some requirements where you're going to be doing a mixture between theoretical, the narrative style, and also the calculations. So there will be some parts where you're having to do both at the same time. But I do think in some of the questions, if you can identify, okay, well, that's a fully narrative question, it's told me not to do any calculations, I can probably do that fairly quickly because I'm confident in that area, then yes, you might want to go for it. Ethics is a great example of that. Ethics is going to be 5 marks in question 1, and it's going to be fairly standalone compared to any of the other requirements in the question, and therefore some people like to start with that, even if it's not actually the first requirement of the question. They like to start with that because they feel comfortable that I'm getting 5 marks under my belt there fairly quickly, and I now can settle down and feel a bit more relaxed about the exam. So yes, good question. Okay, question. So a question about, should we start with the big question, 50 marks, or the 225 mark questions first? I kind of mentioned that earlier about having a go at the mocks. The mocks are a really great place for you to practice that and see what works for you. Generally, I think that for most students, they find doing section B, the 225 mark questions first. They find that a better strategy than going for the section A 50 mark question first, but that won't be the case for everybody. So you need to do what works for you. How are you going to know what works for you? By doing a mock, doing it under timed conditions, putting all your books away and practicing. Try it. Try section B first. And then go on to section A. Keep an eye on your timing. See how your nerves feel. See what works better for you. So for some people, they like the fact that in section B questions, there's less going on. And therefore it can help calm their nerves at the start of the exam because there's less busyness. For other students, they hate the fact that there is a 50 mark question that they don't know what it's on, and that preys on their mind as they do the exam. So you know you best, do some mocks, try it both ways and see what makes you feel more comfortable and helps you actually answer every part of the exam. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Oh my goodness, good question here. Due to the high pass rate of ATX in the September exam, is it fair to say that the pass rate for December will be lower and the exam will be harder? No, it won't be, I promise. I can't tell you what the pass rate will be, but the exams are all very well designed to be fair across all the sittings. They're not going to be the same for every student, of course. It depends on what your strengths and weaknesses are. It depends on your preparation for the exam. But in terms of difficulty level, we don't have easy exams and difficult exams. It's down to each individual student what they find easy and what they find difficult. Another question, if we do the calculations wrong and we give an explanation on the basis of that calculation, will we get any marks? Yes, if there are marks available for explanations. If they only ask you to calculate, don't bother explaining anything. It's a waste of your time. But if it says, one of those ones that says, for example, explain with supporting calculations, yes, if you've made a mistake in your calculations, but then the advice you give on the basis of those wrong numbers makes sense, the marker can give you the credit for that. And another thing about making mistakes is if you make one mistake in a calculation, say capital allowances, for example, and you make one mistake, the marker will actually recalculate everything you do after that, anytime that number impacts another number, to make sure that you've then done the right thing after that. You only get penalised once for a numerical error. Right, a few more minutes left, so let's see what other questions we can cover off. Okay, if a question says state one advantage, Is there any negative marking if we mention a few more, if we've got some extra time left? I mean, there's no negative marking, no. That isn't something that is done, excuse me. So you might think, well, I'm not sure that advantage I get particularly strong. Maybe it's something to do with a change of an accounting date, and you think, I'm not sure that that's good enough. And you've just come up with another idea. Well, don't delete the first one you put down, just put the next one down, because you never know. But that's if you've got some extra time left. But I wouldn't do it to begin with. Let's see, what else have we got? Okay, best advice from now to exam day. How many hours should we study a day? Oh, it's not a question that anybody can tell you, because every student's different. Everyone's circumstances are different in terms of what other commitments you got in your life, what stage you're at this point. So I wouldn't think about it in terms of hours. But what I would say is that if you find yourself only being able to do half an hour a day as we run up to the exam, or an hour a day, I don't think that's enough, to be honest with you. If you find yourself missing a few days, work's busy, family life's busy, and you find yourself going 3-4 days and you haven't done any studying, I think you really need to try and reprioritize some things, because you want to be doing something every day if you can now for the next 4 weeks. You want to try and get longer periods of time where you can really get your head down and get into a past paper question. It doesn't mean you have to sit and do a mock exam every day, because that's a lot of hours of concentration, but you can split it down. You can maybe take one mock and split it into 3 different sessions and just focus on one question at a time. If you find it's a day when you're really busy and you just think, no, I just can't do 3 hours tonight after work, could you read a technical article? Could you go back over a question you did at the weekend that you made mistakes in? Can you go back and focus on those mistakes and recap those areas? So there's definitely little activities you can do even when you're really busy. Let's see if we can pull in one more question. Okay, what would your advice be to go from getting half a mark for a sentence to a full mark? Good question. So I would use, excuse me, connective words, if that's the right term for it. It's things like because, therefore, those kind of words where you've said something, you've made a statement. Now, what's the why? Because. Going that extra step. So not just saying business asset disposal relief is applicable to this person. Don't just leave it at that. Say why. You don't need to give a big, long explanation, but just put something after it. Or if you've written down something quite positive about a particular approach, can you think of a negative? Can you think about a sort of counter? So use however. So you've said something positive, can you then say however and put something negative? So that's maybe a strategy you want to think about. I think we might just be about out of time now. I think, Martin, I think that's probably us. So from my point of view, I just want to say thank you very much to everybody and best of luck with your exam. And I'll hand back to Martin.
Thank you so much, Aileen, for that great session. And thanks everyone for your engagement and your questions. We hope you've got a few things that are going to be useful in your preparations. Please remember that the recording of this session will be available. You should receive a link tomorrow on which you can access that recording. So in case you missed anything or you want to go back and listen in, you will have access to that. Thank you so much for finding time to attend the session today. From the rest of the team at ACCA, it's best of luck from ourselves as you prepare for your exams. Thank you and goodbye.